Welcome to Resilient. My name is Mike Kearney, the Risk and Financial Advisory CMO. I also spend a lot of time with clients and am seeing firsthand the impact, the challenges, and even the opportunities. I know that sounds weird, but the opportunities associated with COVID-19. And that's why this new mini series on the Resilient podcast is so very important to me. We are focusing all of our attention on the evolving impact of COVID-19, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. This special series is all about providing actionable insights, and I want to really paint a finer point on actionable. We're trying to get insights that you can implement today so that you can focus on what you're facing today and what you need to do next. And one of the areas that is front and center for most companies is understanding the impact that the crisis is having on their cash positions. And in my experience, companies are extremely interested in knowing what they could do better to forecast cash and manage their working capital. Today, I've gathered 3 Deloitte leaders to explore this topic. Let me introduce them. First up is Kirk Blair, a partner and national leader of Deloitte's corporate restructuring group. Michael Epstein, a principal who works with companies often in distressed situations. And Caroline Leas, managing director who specializes in helping CFOs transform finance. As I shared in the previous episodes, we are recording these conversations virtually, oftentimes in our homes. I'm actually sitting in my bedroom right now. And the audio has been pretty good, but is certainly not as crisp as when we do it live. We are prioritizing speed over elegance, kind of the phrase of the day. So enough with the introduction. Let's get to our conversation with our 3 Deloitte leaders. So guys, I've got a question that I want to start off with, and it's the fact that we are all living in this virtual world. We're all recording this likely from our houses, and I know for me, I'm having to manage the challenges of my personal and professional lives that are all now intersecting. Probably a good risk that one of my kids is going to run in, or my dog will run in. The question I have for you is, what is the one thing that you're doing to manage your well-being during this difficult time? And Kirk, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is unprecedented, right? But some of the things that I'm trying to do, like many others, is get outside, right, and spend some time in the fresh air. A lot of people in my neighborhood are walking the streets. We're keeping our distance, of course, but it's a good way to get some exercise in. And then, of course, trying to watch the news, but not overdose on some of the media coverage that's going on, but really understanding what the key points are. We're also catching up on a lot of TV shows and series that we haven't seen. So a good opportunity to do that as well.
Yeah, we're doing a lot of binging in my house too. So that's good. Michael, how about you? What are you doing?
So building a little bit on what Kirk said, one of the things that I've got my family doing, myself including, is get up, get dressed early. Especially in my case, I'm putting on workout clothes because I need some exercise, and I don't know when it's going to happen during the day, but I want to be ready. You got to get out of your pajamas. I will add one other thing that I'm doing particularly is using this opportunity for 10, 15 minutes a day, somewhere in there, or even in the evening, reconnecting with someone that I haven't spoken to or seen through a video chat in a long time. Our days are so hectic and they all blend together. At some point, you've got to make time for a social connection in here somewhere.
Yeah, you know what? When you put the workout clothes and you don't work out by the end of the day, you probably feel pretty guilty. So it's actually kind of a nice little cue to nudge you to work out. So I like that. Caroline, how about you? What are you doing?
Yeah, so I am so used to going to the gym and was a regular person for organized group classes. So I really definitely miss that. So I decided to sign up for one of those 30-day challenges and feel like that's a way for me to still stay really active. And, the reminders come every day. So it's a good prompt to, kind of stay focused on that. Also, we've started doing, I guess, similar to others, doing kind of virtual kind of happy hours, both with, teams, colleagues, family members, friends. And it's it's interesting. I think I used to, kind of make fun of my teenage daughter for all the time she spent on her phone or device, or, but here we are. That's our way to stay connected. And so have found it, though, to be a really fun way to, catch up with others in this kind of virtual new way of connecting.
All right, so let's get a little serious. We're going to be talking about cash today, and obviously, cash is critical in today's environment. Kirk?
Yeah, so I think companies are struggling to understand how much cash they're going to need and for how long, right? And this goes back to trying to figure out how their operating models have been impacted, how their shifts in their transacting environment have impacted them, so that they can make decisions. And so, when we think about the cash need, we need to take into account all of those impacts, whether they're positive or negative, and bake them into the scenario planning that's required in this situation, so they can get a good feel for the amount of liquidity they're going to need. And then obviously they're going to need to understand where they're going to go get it, right? And whether they can leverage their existing lines of credit, if there are other capital sources that are available in the market, or whether the federal government through the stimulus package might provide a level of funding as well.
What do you think leaders should be doing today to preserve cash? And does your answer change if this is a protracted crisis, which we just don't know when it's going to end? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies are now thinking about the longer term impact, but they're making dramatic decisions today, right? We're seeing a lot of the workforce being displaced. We're seeing patterns around, supply chains and purchasing being disrupted, and they've got to figure out, where to optimize on these different fronts. And so it's a difficult scenario given the magnitude of this crisis, but factoring that into, again, the scenario planning that they're going to need to do here is what's going to be critical to understand how each one of those areas is impacting the overall operating model, and ultimately the liquidity of the business, right, and the cash flows of the business, so they can evaluate how much money they're going to need.
Michael, what can organizations do today to obtain the liquidity that they need? What are some recommendations or guidance that you have?
So I think the way companies need to approach this is a 3-step process, but these steps have to be executed upon simultaneously. There is, first of all, exercising self-help. So look inward. What opportunities for cash conservation, cash mitigation can you control from your own activities, whether that's deferral of costs or optimizing your working capital or the like, so that you can figure out how much cash you have within your control. Then start to look at your external ecosystem that's already familiar with the company, your existing lenders, your existing partners, your existing alliances, and where are there opportunities to generate liquidity from them, whether it's borrowing more or borrowing new from the same lenders. Once you've gone through that step, you can then start to look at your external non-involved ecosystem players, because in that order, each of those represents an increasing level of difficulty, both in time, management's time and calendar time, as well as information needs and complexity to generating cash. But you need to pursue all 3 of those strategies simultaneously, and you need to pursue them on an organized, programmatic approach, not just playing whack-a-mole and trying to hit the issue that comes up immediately today. To Kirk's point, you need to be thinking forward, because none of us knows how long this is going to last, and every dollar you disperse today, you can't get that dollar back. Most of the management teams out there, frankly, has never really been faced with such a systemic change in their top line simultaneously. And we don't know when this is going to end. We all hope it ends soon, or at least it abates sooner than later, but we don't know when that's going to occur.
So, Michael, how does that impact the guidance that you're giving clients, given the fact that there's so much uncertainty? So, when you're thinking about, forecasting cash out into the future, is there guidance that you give on a timeline? What do you do under this amount of uncertainty?
Look, I think you have to start when you're thinking about scenario planning and modeling. You have to start with a time period over which you can have a reasonable amount of comfort that your forecasting is relatively accurate. So we tend to work in 90-day increments. Why 90 days? Because that represents 13 weeks, which represents 3 months. So if you think about how your actual cash collections and disbursements will then interact with your financial reporting, that is a soundbite where you can have a relative comfort level that you can be accurate. Beyond that, right now, it gets pretty uncertain as to not only how accurate you can be, but right now we don't know whether or not revenue streams will start to come back outside of 90 days. We know where they are for the next 4 weeks. We can be pretty confident on where they're going to be for the next 8 weeks. 13 weeks, you can take manageable estimates on. Beyond that, it's pretty uncertain right now.
Caroline, you spend your entire life helping organizations transform their finance group. And this is potentially one of the biggest transformations that are happening before our eyes. The question I have for you is how are you seeing finance employees adapt to this new virtual environment?
Yeah, no one says, "Oh, we're going to close the books," and you have never had people work from home and close the books. That just never happens. And it's so interesting that that's what's happening all around every company now, that they're making it work. They're making it work to close the books. They're making it work to put together their scenario planning, to come up with cash forecasts. They're doing this. And, I think some are doing it more successfully than others. Some of them that have had different playbooks, obviously ones that have more standardized processes we're seeing that are being more successful. Ones that have, you can think about it, if you have a really clear kind of governance processes, they're more successful. Some that already are using collaboration tools and have already built those into their processes, they're being very successful. I think what you're going to find from organizations coming out of this is they're going to come out of this and say, okay, we should plan for this potentially to happen. What capability or capacity were we missing? And what do we need to now build into the way we work, our tools, our people, whatever it is, and build this into how we move going forward?
Kirk.
I think one of the things that companies need, so we're talking about a significant amount of disruption here, right? And companies need to figure out what the new baseline looks like. This is not business as usual. So how do you plan for something you've never been through or experienced in this environment, right? And, I think Caroline was talking about some of the practical aspects of building these teams and stakeholders within the organization. There needs to be a governance model around how to evaluate these impacts. And there needs to be a baseline around how we're going to move forward, right? And with that baseline, now you can start to understand how the different elements may impact you and what that might have on your finances and your financial situation as you go forward. When we think about liquidity modeling and forecasting, we start with that baseline, then we start to go down to key drivers within those assumptions that drive either cash receipts or disbursements. And we look to align the inflows and outflows from an operating standpoint. And it's really key that the finance team is meeting with the operations team to understand what they're seeing, how they're thinking about it, and what their strategy is going to be in this time of uncertainty. So it's critical that people are working together. There's a governance structure that pulls all that information into one place, and they're able to make decisions. And that's the other critical element. As we've been talking to companies, a lot of them, it almost feels like they don't know how to make these decisions. One, how do I evaluate it? But do I really have to go and make cuts to my workforce? Can I think about some other alternatives? And this is a time when you really need to be thinking action. And as Michael said earlier, the actions you take now will have an impact on your options later. So you need to be aware of that and plan on a conservative basis how to preserve cash.
And just one follow-up question, Caroline. If you were one of those organizations where you say, they're struggling a bit moving virtually from a finance perspective, is there one piece of guidance or advice that you would have for them that you've seen other organizations do well?
I guess I would say just step back. Let's take a look at it programmatically. Okay, what do we have to do? Let's focus on this, organize it, structure it. Okay, organize your team in the same way. You can use all of these tools available to us, collaboration tools, and put people in teams online, right? The same way you would have had your accounts payable team, the same way you would have had an accounts receivable team. You can do that today virtually. And so I would say just programmatically take a step back. Don't panic, but programmatically step forward and go through it.
Hey, Kirk, this is one that each one of you can take, but organizations have been doing cash forecasting, managing working capital, for years. What is different? Like, what's the new normal? What's different about this time? And what are you telling clients that already have operations and tools and approaches for managing cash and forecasting? What are you telling them to do differently?
So I think it's around speed, and it's not about perfection. The tools that we typically use are standards in distress situations and even bankruptcy proceedings, right? 13-week cash flows are a norm. And the reason they're so valuable is because they give you critical insights to make decisions very quickly, right? And you can understand what the impact of those decisions will be. Obviously, variance reporting and looking at the differences between what you thought and what you actually incurred are important to understand. They help calibrate those models and make them more effective as you go forward. So at some point, you get really good at being able to project. But it's almost the simplicity of those models and your ability to get visibility into what those key drivers are, evaluating those key drivers, and how they're being impacted by the external factors.
Michael, how about from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think Mike, building on what Kirk said, I think what's different now is there needs to be a bias to action. What we're talking about here is using tools to drive decision making based on data, whereas historically companies have always said, oh yeah, we do forecasts, we know how to manage our working capital, but they always have managed it within the constraint or through the lens that they've historically always looked at it in their business. So if business processes are either broken or duplicative or inefficient, when you're inside that lens, it's impossible to see it's impossible to know what you don't know. And what the speed to data is allowing you to do is to see where does the data provide me a different outcome or a different result than what I thought my business process would drive to. We've seen companies that say this is how we do things to get at conserving cash, and our answer is, well, I've got data that shows you're not actually doing that, even though you believe you are, and it's eye-opening for management teams because they haven't been able to harness the power of data the way in the past. The way they have now, even though they believed their processes were sufficient for what they're doing.
So Michael, I'm trying to wrap my mind around this. Are you saying that most companies have the approach in place, but maybe they're not accessing the right data, or maybe they don't have the right governance structure on making decisions off of that? What I'm trying to get my mind around is a lot of companies will say, yeah, we're already doing this. And I'm trying to figure out exactly for all of the listeners, like what are one or two things that I should pivot on and do differently, taking into consideration my existing process that I may already have in place, where I'm like, yeah, this has worked, for many years. So does it get down to like how you're accessing data and how you're making decisions with that data? Maybe if you could just elaborate.
I think an analogy, when you talk to departmental managers, especially in finance department, and they say, "Well, my whole team is busy. As a matter of fact, I need to hire more people," as an example, and you bring that old analogy back, which is gas expands to fill the space. I think we learned that in chemistry 101. The fact is that people have been asked to follow procedures and execute on policies and provide outputs, reports. In many cases, I've seen people spending their time, let's say it's 4 hours a week, generating output reports for management committees that have long since been disbanded. They generate this report, they send it to an email address. The person on the other end doesn't bother to write back and say, we don't need that anymore. They just delete it because they just get it over and over and over again. But you don't realize that people are spending their valuable time generating analysis that no one is looking at anymore. And data will help you get at those business processes to understand where people are, for lack of a better term, spinning their wheels. It will also let you get at policies that you think you're executing on. Companies say, well, when we deal with our vendor community, we take advantage of discounts. And as you can imagine, discounts are, discounts can be the converse of cost of funding if you're taking advantage of discounts in your purchasing plan. And when you do the analytics, you find out that they are not taking advantage of discounts, because you can show them at the line item level in their invoicing, their inbound invoices. You can show them at the line item level when they received the invoice and when they paid the invoice, which you couldn't do before until you could harness the power of not only accessing the data, but then crunching the data and then visualizing the outputs, because people are very visual learners in my experience. And when you show them a picture, that it hits home the policy that they are either executing on incorrectly or not executing on at all. And that can occur anywhere within the organization.
Let's go to Caroline. Caroline, what are your thoughts on this question that really gets at what guidance are you giving clients on forecasting and managing cash through the crisis?
Well, actually, I want to build on a little something that Michael was just talking about on that data, and particularly on that front, because it's interesting. And I think we have to recognize, coming out of this crisis, that there are some companies that are frankly just going to be, that are doing better. They're kind of coming out of this stronger, right? They're coming out of this. They're seeing increased sales, right? And so what's interesting, though, is I do think for some companies, because they had recognized, and I think they had been disciplined in harnessing some of the power of that data, in particular, maybe understanding where they have their spend, like for finance, understanding who are their key suppliers, understanding which ones are the key ones in their supply chain, and then looking at, okay, now in times like this isn't an opportunity where you just do your standard discount, but is there an opportunity to do dynamic discounting? And so when these suppliers, look, the trend has been to extend payment terms for the last several years, well beyond 60 days to 90 days plus for across most industries. Now, many suppliers, that is going to be very difficult, and they're going to be very interested or need to have different terms. And so for some suppliers and for some companies, what we're seeing is actually this is the time where they're going to be turning on and looking at leveraging what we call dynamic discounting, or what's called dynamic discounting tools, so that when a supplier is submitting their invoice to the company, right then it says, hey, do you want to be paid earlier? Do you want to be paid now? Here's what it would be for a discount. You want to be paid in 5 days, 10 days, 30 days? What would you like? And it allows that supplier to be able to have the flexibility to see when do they need cash. But I think that's the strategic, and that's where some companies had thought ahead and thought, okay, let me see, how can I maybe better harness some of the data that I have to see how could I take potentially advantage of just have a better understanding of who are those suppliers that should I want to do something like this, I could offer that to them, and that I would do that and not to offer it to everybody, but be strategic about that. And that's just one example.
Caroline, that starts to get into what potentially organizations can do in the future. Is there something that they can do today using that example, or is that more something that maybe if they're not doing it today, they should plan for the future and maybe use this as an opportunity to start thinking ahead?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is something that, if they don't, I mean, I know that if you don't already have the tool, it's, if you're not already thinking of it, is something you'd have to plan ahead for it. I mean, to plan ahead that how would I be, better suited? How do I, make sure that I'm ready to take advantage, just so that I'm better able to, I mean, part of this is a partnership, right? Your supplier relationship is not adversarial, right? These are core to your supply chain. So how do you take it? When I say take advantage, meaning how do you be, collaborative? How do you work with them? But at the same time, understand which ones does it make the most, which one is it advantageous for you to offer that to? And so what should they be doing now is how do they get better access and make sure that they really truly understand their data? I agree with Michael. I think sometimes sometimes companies have a perception of something, but when you actually dig in to the data, you find that the reality is different than the perception.
So one of the things that I've heard many times actually during this conversation, and I believe each of you have said it, is this whole notion of scenario-based forecasting. Can you explain, and any one of you could pick it up and you guys could build on each other's answers, but what exactly is scenario-based forecasting beyond, I think, the obvious, and how can organizations use it today to help them over the next several months? Kirk, you want to take it?
Yeah, well, so scenario planning is in a really important element for any organization who's going through the changes that we're seeing today, right? And it goes back to having that baseline understanding and then thinking about how the organization will be impacted. And that's the visibility you need to make decisions, right? What are the assumptions that we're baking in? How are we thinking about the impact on parts of the organization holistically? What does that do for our customer base? It's really critical to start to document all of those factors, lay them out, and start to think through them in a strategic way, right? So there's going to be tactics here. There's going to be strategic thinking. You want to start with the strategic thinking. Where do I want to get to? And then where am I today? And then what are the things that are going to impact me? And where can I make decisions that will affect, how my company performs and how I get to that ultimate goal that we're thinking where we need to be.
And I think adding on to that, Mike, you have to build a dynamic solution to model this, or you will spend all of your time iterating on how different variables correlate to one another. Having a flexible baseline and having the sensitivity triggers that will impact this so that you can quickly adjust your forward-looking model based on how reality is shaping up over a short period of time versus where you thought you'd be heading. What is your trajectory, and do you need to readjust your trajectory? As Kirk said, do you need to constantly be coming back and looking at saying, I know where my end goal was, and how many degrees off of center am I now versus where I thought I would be? And you can only do that when you have a flexible tool so that you're not constantly working through the mechanics of forecasting and scenario planning versus the assumptions and impact of scenario planning.
Hey, Michael, let's build on that, because I'm curious if you're an organization, do most organizations have these tools that you're referencing that they could start with? And if they don't, is this something that they can actually implement? Obviously, very quickly. We're talking a lot about speed over elegance right now, but is it something that they can implement fairly quickly if they don't have a tool that you're referencing?
I think a lot of companies do have the tools in place to look at holistically at the issues. But this is a change in thinking and mentality, right? As we were talking about before, there's a call to action here. There's not a lot of time to be waiting around to see how things play out and then making decisions. You need to do it now because it's going to have impacts on you later on, depending on how long this lasts. So I think it's taking those tools, and we talked about that governance role again, having people in the room who can talk about, how they're thinking strategically about decision making, what operational issues they need to tackle, and how that factors into their planning and what that means financially, right? So I think it's really just taking the organization and having everyone think a little differently. It really starts with asking the questions of like we talked about initially, how much cash am I going to need over what period of time? Once I understand and frame out what the issues are, I can start to think about the tactics to solve for that problem.
Caroline, do you have any thoughts on this conversation?
Yeah, so I think, to me, the best scenario modeling is really tied to a core set of business drivers, right? You look at what are the core business drivers that are associated with that company's business, right? And then you make a set of assumptions and you model it. And that's it. And you don't need to go to a line item level to do your scenario modeling. I see sometimes, though, many companies sometimes struggle with using just desktop tools to do this. And then certainly it works, but that's going to be harder, right? And so I do agree with what Michael said, that sometimes I think that sometimes the level of sophistication maybe of a finance team, you will find they have tools that allow them to readily be able to, oh, sure, okay, hey, we have a business driver. I can adjust it here. Let's see. But I also think that there's what's interesting about scenario modeling, what I'm seeing, where it used to be typically when you did a scenario modeling, you would have kind of like best case, worst case, and something in the middle, right? Kind of three, right? Typical. Well, that's not anymore. We need more than that. Now we're like 4 to 6 models, right? We have, because now the business, and that really is tied to the complexity of a business, the degree of globalization, right? I have to nuance it differently. So I can't just have 3 models anymore or 3 scenarios. And so you can imagine if you're trying to do all of these different things on your desktop, right? That's going to make that harder to then be able to react. Because I agree with Kirk, right? Part of this is like, we need to be able to make a decision. We have to be able to make decisions. And this is about being able to get to speed of making decisions, not spending more time churning and running data in the model and running scenarios. And I think that that's where, coming out of this too, you're going to find, and we should see finance teams looking back and saying, okay, hey, where did I miss capacity or capability to be able to react faster? And because I think that's where I'm seeing, I was talking with the CFO yesterday, and they were, struggling with trying to just run these scenario models and doing different permutations.
So let me ask you all a question, because I think what's really important is I've heard, it doesn't need to be perfect. I also am hearing a tool's important, but it's not the panacea of truth. I'm hearing that it's not like scenario planning in the past. There's multiple scenarios you need to think through. When you see organizations do scenario planning from a forecasting perspective, is there one area that you would say they all could do a bit better that is actionable in days, not weeks or months? Kirk, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think it's accessing data, right? And accessing those truth tellers that you just mentioned, right? To get the right perspective of how their part of the operation fits into the bigger puzzle. A lot of times in normal times, we'll see financial models, or even in distress, we'll see models that, depict a much more optimistic view. And to look at those underlying assumptions and key drivers that we were talking about, right? You start to realize that, we may not be able to hit those levels or those targets, and we need to think about this a little differently. And so I think it's about, making sure you get the right people again in the room to have the conversations around what the impacts are. Having the truth tellers, getting the right managers at the operational level to have a view. I think that's really valuable to trying to calibrate these types of models and scenarios to the overall plan.
Michael, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, so as to pick up a little on what Kirk said, management tends to have a bias to optimism, a blind spot to optimism, and and again, they are very earnings driven in the scenario planning, and I understand that, but you can't pay payroll with earnings and profits. You can only pay payroll with cash. And if you drive the business toward cash, taking into account all your strategic objectives, you will ultimately, the profits will follow. And I think what I think we need to see companies do is focus more, and certainly now, on driving to liquidity in the business, because the liquidity creates option factors. And having those options will then allow you to adjust your scenario planning as you go, and ultimately, in order to adjust your strategy to fit the environment that's changing around you.
Hey, Michael, you brought up I think a really important point that I just want to pause on, and it's really getting to the positivity bias that many leaders have, which is fantastic. But is there a way to manage that as part of the process that you use for doing scenarios and forecasting, what have you? How do you take that positivity bias out of it as a finance professional?
The only way to take that positivity bias out of it, I believe, is using data. I mean, data doesn't have emotion. Data just is. And you use the data to drive, as you said, to create the guardrails, in my opinion, for that positivity influence. You need that positivity influence, basically, because that's a big part of the foundation of leadership, is driving folks to the world that could be, and driving folks to the world that we together can achieve. That's important, but you need to ground it in the data so that you don't end up with, at the end, as you know, where we sit on the horizon today, 1 degree of separation is not a big deal. But take us forward 6 or 12 months, and 1 degree of separation today could have a significant dislocation between perception and reality 12 months from now.
Caroline, you want to chime in on this conversation?
Yeah, I would say, to me, good data is less churning the numbers and more decisions. And you need to remove and reduce the lag between churning and running numbers and making decisions. And that's where you see companies, I think, make better decisions, more timely decisions. I think that is, that should help the good data, and I agree, focusing on the data, hopefully then helps you remove that bias. But where I see is, we're lagging and we're spending more time, and the time amount that we're spending churning and running models and pulling data, aggregating data, cleansing data, all of this is limiting us from making the right and best decisions.
I have 2 what I'll call lightning round questions. Short, quick responses would be great. The first question is, crisis obviously spurs innovation. The fact that we're working and doing these podcasts virtually and all of that is a great testament to the innovation that's happening right in front of our eyes. In terms of forecasting and managing cash, all the conversation that we've had today, what innovation do you see in the future? Michael?
I think, to touch on something we said earlier, and following on Kirk, mining the data, getting to the output more quickly will actually allow us to narrow that positivity gap.
And Caroline?
And I would say build capacity. That data, mining the data, builds capacity to either make decisions or, whatever it is in the organization.
So we've got folks that are listening to this interview. We've talked about a lot of different things, but if they are challenged today with their cash management, their liquidity, their working capital, their forecasting, if there's one thing that you want them to take away something that they should focus on today? And obviously, this is a very general question because organizations are in very different places. But if there's one takeaway, what would it be? Caroline, we'll start with you.
If there's one thing that they should do today, cash is king, right? You absolutely have to know what you need today and what you're going to need tomorrow. So you need to get access to the data, what you're going to need today and what you're going to need tomorrow. That's absolutely imperative.
Great. Michael.
And I'm going to build on what Carolyn just said, because once you have that answer, don't hide the truth. Transparency with your stakeholders is of the utmost importance, because you can get people to move mountains when you're credible and when you're communicating with them.
Kirk, let's bring us home. What's your one takeaway?
Yeah, I think it's one of the comments that we made earlier around not letting perfection get in the way. This is about speed to insight and taking action.
Wow. Kirk, Michael, and Caroline, thank you very much for the gift of time. Your insights are timely and critical to many companies out there. I know that this is a stressful and unpredictable time for all organizations. I feel like I'm saying that after each episode, but it is absolutely true. And as I shared in the opening, we are going to continue with our special edition COVID-19 interviews on Resilient. So if you have any recommendations, let us know. You can hit me up on LinkedIn, Michael Kearney, or even on Twitter, mkearney33. For more insights across all aspects of this topic, go to Deloitte.com. You can also find the Resilient podcast on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and even Spotify. And I have learned over doing all of these Resilient interviews, almost for 4 years now, that resilient leaders take care of themselves. And in this time of uncertainty and stress, this has never been more important. Personally, I am exercising every day. I'm finding time and even meditating. So whatever you do, find something that gives you a bit of space. Until next time, stay safe and remain resilient.